Bon, je vais commencer par remercier Jean-Marc, Semir, Christian, Bertrand, everyone who included me in such a privileged symposium. Obviously, I'm going to speak in English. If I try to give a little talk in French, I'm always reminded of a story of a guy named William Casey. William Casey was director of the CIA, organization maybe you've heard of. And he spoke a little bit of French. And when he did a world tour, is it okay? Okay. So when Bill Casey, with his little bit of French, did a tour, he was in the Ivory Coast. He gave a speech in French, and the local newspaper in Abidjan said the director of the CIA gave a speech in his native language. And Bill Casey said to his staff, either my French is much better than I thought, or it's so bad they think I was speaking in English. So anyway, I will just start by speaking in English. It's actually a very interesting compliment. Not coming up? It's the... Yes, it's this one here. Good. It's a good combination to talk about nickel history and nuclear future, partly because nickel and nuclear are almost homonym. We have an expression in English called nickel and dime. Nickel and dime means not very expensive. Unfortunately, nuclear reactors are anything but not very expensive. Nuclear reactors today cost about $8 billion. 50 years ago, you could get one for $250 million, so that means the inflation is about a factor of 32. It's kind of like a World Cup in reverse. Anyway, I'm going to talk about energy future. I have 3 preliminary introductory comments about the organization of the talk, and then I have 10 arguments. Hopefully I can run through them very quickly. I work at a Catholic school. We're encouraged to think in 3s and 10s. So that's the way I'll go. Actually, Christian, thank you for helping me with PowerPoint. I never do PowerPoint. I don't know what I'm doing with PowerPoint. When I was a graduate student, like some of the students here, I was working for the director of Livermore Laboratory, and he was working on a Star Wars project. And he sent me to a conference with a lot of Europeans because Europeans were skeptical that Star Wars technology was ready. And so the director of the Star Wars organization was there to tell the Europeans, we have no difficulty in America intercepting missiles that travel 7 kilometers per second. Unfortunately, the presentation was delayed about half an hour because the Star Wars scientists could not get the slide projector to operate. Anyway, so that traumatized me. But I will try to do my best with the PowerPoint. It's also, yes, with Christian's help. So I want to talk about energy future. And you probably already know that the future of energy is more and more consumption. Substantially more, right? Economic growth, demographic growth. So this is a chart from an annual report that came out about a month ago from the Department of Energy in the US, and it shows that energy is expected to grow at about 50% between now and 2050, maybe 49% between now and 2049. The bad news, a little bit discouraging, the lower line is fossil fuel. So you might be surprised to know that we will actually continue, at least it is expected, that we will continue to use fossil fuel, and that fossil fuel will still account for 70%, 70, of our energy consumption in 2050. That's down from 80% today, but it's up 20% in absolute terms. Now, the first way that I want to focus a little bit, please, is I want to focus on electricity. Electricity, of course, is a little bit of an aristocratic subset of energy. Actually, speaking of aristocracy, I feel like I'm in the movie Children of Paradise, and all of the children are up on the balcony, and there are no aristocrats in the front. Anyway, electricity is a very noble form of energy. I'm sure that you agree that it's nice to charge our phone with an on-off switch, a power cord in the wall, rather than putting it in a fireplace at home, or maybe in the gas tank of our car. MIT, the university in the US, a technical university, actually believes that electricity is so fundamental to the quality of life that they say that countries move from developing to developed, not as a function of GDP per capita, but as a function of the consumption of electricity per capita. They mark it at 4,000 kilowatt hours per year per person. In the US, we're at 12,000. France is at 6,000. China's at 3,000. India is at 1,000. The world is around 3,000. But bottom line is the electricity is so coveted that it's anticipated that it will increase between now and 2050 at a rate of 100%, right? Energy at 50, electricity at 100. Now, I'm going to focus within electricity on nuclear power. It's one source of electricity. It's not even a big source. It's a relatively small source. Right now, it's about 10% of global electricity. And it's anticipated that in 2050, nuclear will increase, absolutely, but it will remain around 10% of our power. So again, 10%, it's not a lot. But then again, if you look at the defense budget of the US or the defense budget of China or the defense budget of France, they're typically 2, 3, 4% of our GDP. And so it's a significant amount. And nuclear is significant for other reasons I will get to in my argument. And then the third way I'd like to limit the focus is by geography. So you know that in the West, nuclear is diminishing. In the US, we expect to go from about 100 reactors to around 50. In France, part of the European Union, maybe from about 60 to about 40. But in Asia, nuclear power is coming on strong. In India, it's anticipated that they'll move from around 5. They have more than 5 reactors, but let's just say 5 gigawatts. Usually a reactor is about 1 gigawatt. But so they're going to move from around 5 reactor equivalent to around 50. Russia might go from 40 to 50. And most importantly, China is looking like they will go from 50 to 150. Next. So let me focus on China. I do that with a little bit of trepidation because there's so much Chinese expertise in this room. I wish I had selected India. India is very much a wild card, but I will keep with the plan of talking about China. So this is a graph that's a little bit of a variation on the previous one. The previous one said China will probably move from around 50 nuclear reactors today to around 150 in 2050. But that's the middle trajectory. The lower one, the minimum, is more like 50 to 100. And the upper one, the maximum one, is more like 50 to 250. So, by the way, 5 years ago, the maximum would have been 50 to 500. So already that's been scaled back significantly. What I'd like to do is go through 10 reasons why I think, to kind of disaggregate what is driving Chinese nuclear power. And I will go through 10 quick reasons, 10 drivers, if you will. First one is electricity. So we've kind of already talked about this. But notice on the left that if electricity is anticipated to grow by 100% to 2050, that 100% is very different in different regions. So in the developed world, right, the OECD, the increase is only 50%. In the non-developed world, which we include China and India, right, the non-OECD, the increase is 200%. And China specifically, I'm going to give you slightly different dates, but from 2000 to 2040, Chinese electricity demand is anticipated to go up by a factor of 7. So we've got a factor of half, a factor of 3, and in China, a factor of 7, from 1.5 to roughly 11 trillion kilowatt hours. With that much electrical demand, nuclear power may make a contribution. Second, let me say something about oil. Oil is a little bit strange because oil is actually now decoupled from electricity. We don't use oil to generate electricity. Oil is the #1 source of energy because we drive cars, but it's really not at all important in generating electricity. It was before Yom Kippur, but now we've moved out of the business. So the green line is oil over the last 20 years. It's gone from 20 back here % of electricity to 10 to maybe 1, maybe 5, and in 2050 maybe 1, and that's because the Saudis will still generate power with oil. China's kind of important because there's a chance that oil will now be decoupled not only from electricity but from energy, and that's if we see the development of electric vehicles. Thank you, you've already anticipated. So, right, as cars proliferate, in China you can see the line showing that the number of passenger miles in China is anticipated to multiply by a factor of 4. Okay? That means a lot of oil imports. It also means a lot of smog in Chinese cities. So China has at least a double motivation to move into electric vehicles, and they have the ability to aspire to leadership in the industry because you'll notice already China is by far the #1 producer of cars, right? They produce more cars than Germany, Japan, US, South Korea, India combined. Next. Obviously, if you're going to have an electric car, you want to plug it in, and you can maybe plug it into a nuclear reactor. You might need a long extension cord. Number 3 is natural gas. Now, natural gas not decoupled from electricity, and in fact, we have a surge, especially in the US, of the production of natural gas and the use of natural gas for electricity. In the United States, the reason why nuclear power is diminishing is not because of Fukushima, it's because gas is such a cheap competitor. Now, China actually has a lot of natural gas, but the gap between production and consumption is getting wider. And that means for China, more and more natural gas imports. And you might guess that China is not eager to be more and more dependent on another strategic resource, especially from Russia. Next one. So coal. Coal is diminished. Coal used to be the #1 source of electricity on the planet. In the West, it's being phased out, slowly but surely, but not in Asia. You see that in China on the right, the black bars, you see that coal is less and less a percentage of electricity, right? 75 down to 30 in 2050. But on the left, you see that absolutely China will continue, right, to rely on coal for 4 trillion kilowatt hours. That's a lot of power. Next one, please. And you know that coal is not only filthy, but it's warming. And so one of the reasons why China's carbon emissions have skyrocketed in the last 20 years is because of the use of coal. So China, I'm sorry the lines are not very clear, but China has gone from around 3 gigatons to around 12 gigatons of total emissions. That means 20 years ago, China did half the emissions of the US, and now they do twice the emissions of the US. We still do twice the emissions of China per capita, but as a country, China is going up and away, and nuclear power might be a way that Xi Jinping can try to do a little bit of climate crisis leadership, given the fact that the United States has abandoned that aspiration. Next, please. Right, again, if you might be demoralized, but carbon futures, in spite of the Paris conference, COP21, and the ones that have followed, our carbon futures are not looking better, they're looking worse. Next, please. This is just a historical, not a futuristic. Future would be more impressive. But historically, this shows you how much carbon nuclear power has avoided putting in the atmosphere. 60 gigatons, that's roughly 2 years of global emission. Not insignificant, please. Now, there are other ways to generate power in a clean way, right? Nuclear is not the only non-fossil fuel. And renewables are definitely taking off, partly because costs have come down dramatically in the last 10 years. Solar has come down by a factor of 10. Onshore wind has come down by a factor of 50%. So you now see with every year the newest projections are more and more robust and optimistic about renewables in 2050. Bloomberg is among the most optimistic, and they believe that, I'm sorry, back one. Back one. I'm still on that, yeah, thank you. If you can go and, yeah, thank you. So this is Bloomberg. And Bloomberg thinks that wind and solar alone will account for 50% of electricity in the year 2050, right? 50-50. If you add hydro, another clean energy, it's more like 60%. And you'll see that China is around the global average. The United States is lagging, and Europe is leading. Unfortunately, there are challenges to renewables, even with cost reductions, that may make it difficult, if not impossible, for renewables to totally fill the electricity demand. One of them is location. A lot of times the sun shines and the wind blows, not near population centers, and transmission can be expensive. And it can be ecologically sensitive. Another problem is intermittency, right? The sun doesn't shine at midnight unless you're in Norway in the month of June. So anyway, the bottom line is that there are challenges to renewables. It's a little controversial, but it may be that there's a future in which increasing renewables and diminishing fossil fuels still has a space for nuclear. Next, please. I've already mentioned nuclear costs. In the West, they've suffered hyperinflation. But in China, they haven't. And they've suffered inflation in China, but not hyperinflation. Same in India. This graph is a little complicated, but it shows you that the cost of a nuclear reactor in China is half the price of a nuclear reactor in the United States or Europe. And that leads to another issue, and that is if you can make nuclear reactors cost competitive, you also have an export industry. And of course, already the Belt and Road Initiative has an enormous energy infrastructure, right? There's an enormous energy component to Belt and Road. But today, most of it is coal in Asia, maybe hydro in Southeast Asia, maybe coal in Africa. But increasingly, there may be a nuclear niche. Already, China is building reactors in Pakistan. They're part of a plan to build reactors in England. They're bidding for reactors in Romania, in Argentina, in South Africa, and other places. One more. Thank you. Next one. Thank you so much. Safety. This is a little bit ideological. There's no question the nuclear industry has radically underestimated the dangers of nuclear power. Okay, Fukushima, Chernobyl. On the other hand, arguably, there's no question that every source of power has risks and dangers. Coal every year kills 6,000 coal miners in China. Coal every year results in premature deaths of 1.6 million Chinese. This is not the dam that I'm referring to, but in 1975, China had a dam that failed, and 200,000 people died. So whatever your energy source, you need to make a calculation of the dangers and the risks. Ninth is the weapons connection. Nuclear power, of course, is intimately connected to nuclear weapons. Okay? The infrastructure is androgynous. Let me just give you one story to illustrate. This is it. That's it. North Korea continues to expand its arsenal. It continues to launch short-range, medium-range rockets. And next one, please. And President Trump gets reelected. Okay, well, once President Trump is reelected, his reputation precedes him. And if you're an ally of the United States, you're going to start diving for cover because you know you're going to be thrown under a bus. So the Japanese have had over 50 nuclear reactors. Without getting too complicated about separated versus unseparated plutonium, or how much plutonium is in Europe and how much is in Japan, the bottom line is if Japan makes a political decision to go nuclear weapon, they've got the materials to build thousands, not hundreds. You need 5 kilos for a plutonium bomb. The Japanese have 50 tons, even if they only have 10 tons separated in Japan. So Japan can very quickly ramp up a nuclear weapon capability. Next one. If Japan ramps up a nuclear weapon capability, I would assume that China will respond. China has 300 nuclear weapons, but if Japan has 1,000, I think China will then take advantage of the infrastructure it has for nuclear power, doing things like enriching uranium to expand its arsenal. And then finally, the political dimension. In the West, of course, nuclear is diminishing, partly because nuclear is unpopular, and because the West is relatively democratic. Okay, the United States is becoming less democratic. People ask me, how do you know when President Trump is lying? And I have to admit that you know when his lips are moving. But the bottom line is, in China, we don't know if nuclear power is popular or unpopular because there's not very much transparency or democracy. It may be that nuclear power is popular. I find it interesting, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but in 6 months of protest in Hong Kong for more freedom, I don't think there's been a word of opposition about the fact that Hong Kong relies on nuclear reactors next door in Shenzhen for 25% of its power. And furthermore, it's ironic that the first 2 French advanced reactors, called EPRs, are now operating not far from Hong Kong, not in Finland and not in France, where they're radically behind schedule still and over budget. Anyway, to sum up, nuclear power has its advantages and its disadvantages. Advantages, it may give a better quality of life to a lot of people in the short term. It may give the planet a little bit more of quantity of life in the long term. On the downside, you might get more accidents like Fukushima, and you might get a nuclear winter when India and Pakistan go to war. The bottom line, though, is the country that will determine nuclear future is China. Thank you so much.
Thank you.